the idea of a code, which when I was young was that there was a code of the gentleman. And I don't mean the gentleman in the British aristocratic sense, but an American guy. There were certain things he was supposed to do and be and live up to. And if you were a guy, your word was your bond. You were gracious in victory, and you were stalwart in defeat. And I'd go through a cliche, a set of cliches in the book, and I said, but they're cliches precisely because they were so widely accepted. And I don't know of any members personally of the new upper class that have that sense of a conscious code of virtuous behavior. And the same goes, of course, for women. And in that context, you then have, on their part, though, a sense of superiority, and you have a sense, because, Sam, these same people who say that IQ tests only measure the ability to take IQ tests, these people are very proud of their IQs, of how smart they are, of how able they are. And they also have lost a sense of seemliness. The idea in 1955, if you lived anywhere except Newport, Rhode Island, that you should build a 15,000 square foot house was ridiculous. It would be unseemly. And I guess that if you went up to Scarsdale or to the North Shore of Chicago at that point, you could also find mansions up there. So, but we were talking about a very small number of places that had that kind of conspicuous wealth. And just to add another fact, since I mentioned the North Shore, if you were in the North Shore of Chicago in 1960, and in the most elite communities, you were still in communities where about 3/4 of the people didn't have college degrees, and where the median family income in those towns was around $60,000-$70,000 in today's dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you had the mansions all right, but you had within those communities a lot of other people who didn't fit that description, and you were not isolated from them by a barrier of 4 intervening zip codes that were almost as rich as you were. So there is simply now people living in the bubble, as I've called it. Their kids are being raised in the bubble. Their kids have never known anything except that. So increasingly what you have inhabiting the new upper class are people who are divorced by 2 or 3 generations from folks who worked with their hands, folks who worked in factories, ran small shops. They've known nothing but this rarefied world that David Brooks described so wickedly and so funnily in Bobo's in Paradise.
To give a picture of this isolation, I think is useful. So, for instance, it's startling for me to reflect on this, but I think it's true to say that certainly among my peers and people who I am social with, I think there may be a few young people I know who fall outside this, but I think it's true to say that the last person on earth I knew who smoked cigarettes was Christopher Hitchens. I literally,
I bet you're right.
If my life depended on it, I could not find another person who smoked cigarettes in my contact list. And let's say there's 1,000 people in there, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's an amazing fact in a society where something like 30% of people smoke cigarettes.
That's a wonderful illustration of how isolated. Because in my case, I do know people who smoke cigarettes, but that's only because I go play poker at Charlestown, West Virginia casino. And there, about 30% of the guys I play poker with smoke. But that's in terms of American Enterprise Institute where I work. I don't know anybody who smokes there. I don't. Social circles, no.
And conversely, if you're a smoker listening to this podcast, I'm sure you're surrounded by people who smoke cigarettes.
Yep, because of the separation. And it goes on to so many other things. The most brutal illustration that I have heard of the contempt that the new upper class has for these smoking non-elite people comes from Clive Crook, the journalist, the columnist. Mm-hmm. who bought a house in West Virginia for a weekend house. He lives in Georgetown in Washington. And he has a great time out there with his wife. They've made friends of the people who lived out there. They're great neighbors. But in Georgetown, when they'd heard that Clive had bought a house in West Virginia, it was like they expected them to be characters out of Deliverance, if you remember that novel.
Yeah.
With missing teeth and can't talk right and are barely human. And they had no hesitation in using the most, not just condescending, but hateful language about these people. And they probably have never met a West Virginian in their life and have no idea what that's like.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that with very little information about someone, it seems like you could reliably predict their worldview. So, for instance, if you told me that someone subscribes to a magazine like Architectural Digest or the New York Review of Books.
I was just thinking of New York Review of Books, yeah.
I feel like, I mean, I could be wrong about this on some questions, but I feel I could make money all day long betting on the things they believe and don't believe, about whether they support gay marriage, for instance, or whether they believe in climate change, with a single data point like that. And
you could predict what kinds of alcohol they drink and don't drink. You could predict where their kids go to, what kinds of schools their kids go to. All sorts of stuff all day. You're right.
Let's just talk a little bit about what the costs are to this kind of stratification. And also, how many people are we talking about? When you talk about the narrow elite, are you talking about a truly tiny number of people, like 100,000 people or something?
I'm talking about a tiny number of people. And 100,000 is probably a good ballpark figure. Just think about it for a minute. If the narrow elite I define as people who have an effect on the nation's politics, economy, and culture. The broad elite are people who have an effect on those things in their own city, but their city is Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Kansas City, whereas the others are the national. Okay, so think of it in terms of journalists, and start to list the op-ed columnists and the journalists at the Washington Post and the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal who really have national influence. You're going to run out of names after in the dozens, okay? After the first several dozen, you are still with people who have quite successful careers, but they aren't the ones who can move the needle. And if you go with the same kind of question into the worlds of finance, into the worlds of television and who produces what's on TV, you get past the dozens. But in each of those cases, you're probably talking about hundreds or a couple of thousand people in each of those niches who are the movers and shakers. And you add them all up, and the top 100,000 people in terms of influence in this country probably explain a whole lot of the variance the decisions get made. Why is this a problem? Well, the classic, or at least the example I use all the time, is it doesn't make a difference if a truck driver in Tulsa, Oklahoma can't empathize with the priorities of a Secretary of Commerce. But it makes a huge difference if the Secretary of Commerce cannot empathize at all with the priorities of truck drivers in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because the Secretary of Commerce, the things that he or she does, can transform that person's life for the worse. I would say for the better, except that they very seldom do it for the better. They usually get in the way of the guy making a living. Well, the same thing is true of whether you're talking about the people who write dramas for television or the people who are working in the IT world. Insofar as they have no idea what the life of ordinary Americans is like, they're likely to do things that are mistakes, that have greater or lesser consequences, but they're mistakes. And it would be really nice if the people who run the country had a deep, intuitive understanding of their fellow Americans.
You know, much of what we're saying here is, as I said, draws a direct line to what happened in the most recent presidential election, and the fact that is still a source of perfect astonishment to many of us that we now have Donald Trump as president of the United States. I mean, what do you make of our current situation politically and it was amazing to hear you describe the traditional ideals and values of a well-behaved, self-respecting American, and to be able to check the antithesis of all of those values exemplified by Trump. I mean, he is the Antichrist with respect to values like honesty and integrity and being a good winner and a good loser. And I mean, it's just, you could not get a more perfect embodiment of the absence of those qualities. And yet he's president. But what has been your experience of being a very visible conservative never Trumper? I mean, you must have had a similar experience of people like David Frum and other people on the classically right of center who came out early and loudly against Trump. What's that been like?
Well, it was chastening because I clearly was so wrong for so long about things. For example, I kept saying, look, the working class guys I know would hate Trump if he lived next door for the reasons you just mentioned, but also working class guys don't talk about their wives the way that Trump did. Not very many of them do. Mm-hmm. And working class guys hate people who brag about their money. I mean, that's just kind of the tackiest, most unattractive thing you can do. And what I didn't get was the extent to which they were looking upon Trump as the murder weapon, as I put it a while ago. Mm. That he was a guy who was not acting like this establishment elite, and they put the other Republican candidates in that category just as much as they put Hillary Clinton in that category. But Trump also was doing something that I don't think I gave him enough credit for, and that is he really was talking to them in other kinds of ways that worked. And for this, I got a very interesting anecdote when I was signing books at a thing a couple of months ago, and the woman who gave me the book to sign said, I grew up across the street from Donnie Trump. And Donnie Trump, apparently, even though his father was already pretty rich at that time, still lived in a pretty ordinary neighborhood in Queens. And she was saying, oh yeah, when there was ever construction in the streets, Con Ed fixing something or something, Donnie would be out there talking to the guys. And all at once I said, okay, so it's not Donald Trump, the nouveau riche vulgarian, that's accomplishing all this. It's the Donnie Trump who used to go out and talk to the guys working construction in Queens. And so I was wrong in understanding the nature of that appeal. What all this means, I think you have to divorce the person of Donald Trump from the movement, so that Trump may or may not get through his years in office, successfully in some ways or not, I don't know. But one thing that is quite clear is that people like me, who consider ourselves limited government conservatives, I like to use the word Madisonian to describe people like me. We like the Constitution of limited government and enumerated powers and all that kind of thing. And local control and subsidiarity. We are a tiny fraction of the electorate. That what the last election did was say that you've had the left, which has kind of abandoned the old-fashioned definitions of liberty and freedom and egalitarianism in favor of the social democratic versions of them now, which people in the left, in deeply principled ways, think are the best way to go. But meanwhile, over on the right, you've had principled limited government people who thought that a lot of the blue-collar Republican voters were at least sympathetic to those ideals. And it turns out that really they aren't very interested in those. They were naturally blue-collar Democrat voters. Historically, they shifted over because of a Democratic Party that they thought had abandoned them, particularly white working class. But they've shifted over for reasons of feeling more comfortable with the Republicans, not because they believe in conservative principles. So long term, I think we're going to have a redefinition of the parties such that the Republicans will be a populist-centered party for a long time to come. I will add, Sam, I have been consistently wrong on all things political for the last 18 months, so I'm probably not changing that track record now.
Well, you're in good company there. This final topic I want to raise with you is, on its face, a very surprising thing for you to be endorsing. This is the topic of universal basic income, which I've talked about in some context on this podcast as a possible remedy for the increasing role that automation is playing in our economy. And so what happens when automation and, in the limit, AI get so good that jobs disappear and new ones never spring up in their place? How do you deal with what would be a 50 or 70% unemployment rate in some possible future? Well, one answer, and this is an answer that is older than I realized, but it's suddenly very popular and current in Silicon Valley. You give people money, and this is called universal basic income. You've written a book about this, which unfortunately I haven't read, but I've heard you talk about it. And this is a surprise because in Coming Apart, you are fairly critical of the welfare state in all its guises, and you just said something that at least implied disparagement of the welfare state in Europe as we know it. So tell me why you are an advocate for universal basic income.
Well, I first wrote the book back in 2005 or 6 called In Our Hands, but I did it initially for the same reason that Milton Friedman was in favor of a negative income tax. The idea is that you replace the current system with a universal basic income, and that you leave people alone to make their decisions about how to use it. But the other reason I wanted to write the book is because I thought, and I still think, it provides a way in which we might actually revitalize America's civic culture, which is to say, the civic culture in which a lot of problems get solved at a very local level. And the reason I make that argument is that an income stream, and under my plan, the money would be deposited every month electronically into a known bank account. An income stream gives people moral agency, whether they want it or not. Let's take the example of a guy who is living off his girlfriend, and he can't seem to hold on to a job, and he's feckless, and she puts up with him, she loves him. Well, all at once now he's got an income stream. I think it's quite probable that the young woman will say, you know what? I think kicking in $300 or $400 a month at this point is appropriate. I think that's a very good thing for her to do, and it's very good for him to be hit with that request. I also think it's a good thing that if he drinks up all his money under a universal basic income with 10 days to go, that his friends or his girlfriend or his parents or anybody, other people say, well, we aren't going to let you starve, but it's time to get your act together. And I think that kind of saying to someone, don't tell us you're helpless because you aren't helpless. The question is whether you're going to do anything about it. I think those kinds of interactions on millions of times a day around the country would be a good thing. And I'm also, if there's one thing that Writing the Bell Curve did, it sensitized me to the extent to which a high IQ is pure luck. Yeah. None of us earn our IQ. Whether it's nature or nurture, we aren't the ones who did the nurturing. Hard work and perseverance and all these other qualities are great. Can't take credit for our IQ. We live in a society that's tailor-made for people with high IQs. The people who got the short end of the stick in that lottery, mixing my metaphors, they deserve our admiration and our support if they're doing everything right. And so now I'm thinking about a couple. They each make $13,000 a year, let's say. So that's a really low-paying job if they're working full-time. That's $26,000. They're scraping by. They're above the poverty line, but not by much. Really hard to raise kids that way. Suppose you have a $12,000 a year universal basic income. That's 24 onto their 26. All at once, they're at 50 grand. And with that 50 grand, they can have a good lower middle class income. They can raise a family. All sorts of things open up to them that weren't open before. That's the reason for the title of the book, Putting Lives Back in Our Hands. And So I think replacing the welfare state with that is going to be the rare case where you have side effects that are not unintended side effects that are terrible, but unintended side effects that have the potential for rejuvenating American civic culture. I put out a revised version of the book just last year, 2 years ago, because of precisely the issue you're talking about. I am one of those people who say, I know how hard it is to say this time is different. I know the Luddites have been saying that for 2 centuries, and they've always been wrong. This time is different. AI is, I think, on the cusp of a J curve, where it goes from a very slow progress over the last couple of decades to nonlinear acceleration in the things it can do, and I think it will transform the job market unrecognizably within 20 or 30 years.
I certainly do as well. And are you worried at all about the incentives just not being aligned if you give out universal basic income? Is there any tweaking of it that makes it more likely to produce the good changes you're picturing?
Oh, there are a couple of, I think, really, really important things. And one of them is that indeed you do get rid of the welfare state services. And the second thing is that you have a very high point at which the guaranteed income is subject to a surtax. I want to lure people into working so they get to a point where they can't afford to quit. Let's say, in my plan, I say it's $30,000 of earned income. So until you get $30,000 of earned income on your own, you keep all of the, let's say, $12,000. And then after that, you start to pay a small surtax back. Well, okay, so you have been in a situation where you have the $12,000, but anything you go out and earn, you keep. So you've gotten into the habit of working, and if you've gotten up to $30,000, you are not going to trade a $42,000 a year lifestyle for a $12,000 a year lifestyle. But if you have the payback point quicker, I think you increase the likelihood that you have disincentives to work.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be deposited electronically into a known bank account. It needs to be universal, because one of the key things about this is that everybody knows that everybody else is getting the money. And so once you have that universal knowledge, then a whole variety of interactions can be set in motion that wouldn't be set in motion without that knowledge. So, yeah, you can tweak. You can either have it be disastrous, but you can also fairly easily design it so that it's quite likely to produce good effects. I am not denying it will have work disincentives. There will be work disincentives, but we are already at a point, Sam, where something more than 20% of working-age males with high school diplomas and no more are out of the labor force. So we already have a whole lot of guys sitting at home in front of a TV set or a Game Boy, probably stoned on meth or opioids, doing nothing. We got a problem already. And I see a lot of ways in which the moral agency that an income would give could make the problem less.
The dysfunction you see in white and largely rural America now, is it analogous to the dysfunction that we were seeing in the black inner city starting a few decades ago? Are there important differences, or how do you view that?
In some ways, it followed pretty much the same trajectory. Way back in 1992 or 3, it was, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called "The Coming White Underclass." And I was simply tracking the growth in non-marital births among white working class people. And I said to myself, along with Pat Moynihan, who said it better and first, that if you have communities in which large numbers of young men are growing to adulthood without a male figure, you ask for and get chaos. And I assumed that what had happened in the black community when non-marital births kept on going up was going to happen in the white community. So in that sense, they followed pretty much a predictable trajectory. What was not predictable was the degree of demoralization that seems to be special to white working class in the last 17 years. And here the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton, the economists at Princeton, on the rising mortality from cirrhosis of the liver and opioid overdosing and other kinds of diseases that indicate dysfunction. That rise has been anomalous. So that whereas the death rate from those causes among white working class was 30% lower than for blacks in the 1990s, it's now 30% higher. That's different. I think white working class America has become demoralized in a uniquely devastating way since the turn of the century.